On September 8, 1941, German forces completed the encirclement of Leningrad, the second city of the Soviet Union. What followed was 872 days of siege, the longest and most destructive siege in modern history. By the time it ended, nearly 1 million civilians had died, most of them starved to death. Leningrad, today St. Petersburg, was a city of enormous symbolic importance. It was the cradle of the Russian Revolution, the former imperial capital, and one of the great cultural centers of Europe. Adolf Hitler was determined to destroy it entirely. His orders were explicit. The city was not to be accepted if it offered surrender. It was to be razed to the ground. The population, over 3 million people, would be left to die. The German assault on Leningrad in September 1941 was expected to be swift. Army Group North had advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks. But the city held. Soviet defenders threw up fortifications and counterattacked with desperate intensity. The Germans captured the town of Schlüsselburg on September 8, cutting the last land route into the city. Leningrad was now surrounded on 3 sides by German and Finnish forces, and on the 4th by Lake Ladoga, a body of water that was frozen in winter, open in summer, and always within range of German artillery. The first winter of the siege was the most terrible. German artillery and air bombardment struck the city continuously. Food supplies dwindled with terrifying speed. By November 1941, the daily bread ration for most civilians had fallen to 125 grams, a few thin slices, supplemented by whatever could be found. People ate sawdust mixed into bread, boiled leather, wallpaper paste, and eventually the corpses of pets, and, in the worst cases, other human beings. The only supply line was across Lake Ladoga. In winter, trucks drove across the frozen lake, often breaking through the ice under German air attack. The route became known as the Road of Life. It saved the city. In summer, barges made the crossing. Neither was enough to fully supply a city of millions. Children were evacuated in their hundreds of thousands, but most civilians remained. The city's artists, musicians, and writers refused to be silenced. Dmitri Shostakovich composed his 7th Symphony inside Leningrad in 1941, completing it as the German forces closed in. The symphony was performed in the city in August 1942 by the surviving musicians of the Leningrad Radio Orchestra, some of whom had to be brought back from the front. The broadcast was amplified over loudspeakers into no man's land toward German lines. It was an act of cultural defiance as powerful as any military action. Soviet forces attempted repeatedly to break the siege. Costly offensives in 1942 and early 1943 failed with enormous losses. In January 1943, a narrow corridor was finally opened through German lines, too narrow and too shallow to provide adequate supply, but enough to improve the city's chances. Then, on January 27, 1944, the siege was broken entirely. Soviet forces drove the Germans back from the city in a massive offensive. That evening, Leningrad held a salute of 24 artillery salvos. The people who survived wept in the streets. The siege of Leningrad killed approximately 800,000 to 1.5 million civilians. The estimates vary, but all are staggering. It was one of the worst humanitarian disasters in human history. The city received the highest Soviet military honor, the Order of Lenin, and was designated a hero city. Leningrad endured because its people chose to endure. They chose to stay and fight and starve rather than surrender to a regime that had promised their annihilation. They maintained their art, their music, their humanity in conditions that would have destroyed a lesser community. It is one of the most extraordinary acts of collective will in the history of warfare, and one of the least known.